fallen leaves crunch beneath your feet as you make your way toward your tree stand. It's another beautiful autumn day, and you're glad to be in Utah's incredible outdoors. You get butterflies in your chest as you imagine placing the perfect shot after months of archery practice. Your mouth waters as you envision the delicious meals that you will share with your family after you harvest your deer. This is Wild, a Utah division of Wildlife Resources podcast. I'm your host, Faith Heaton-Jolly, and this is Episode 5, Big Game Management. All right, so welcome back to Wild. Today's episode is going to be kind of a little bit different, but fun. So I have with me 3 of our big game biologists from around the state. So we're doing kind of more of a panel discussion today than our traditional one-on-ones. We're going to be talking today, as you could guess, all about big game management in Utah, kind of answering some of the questions that we've been getting recently on how it works and why we do what we do. So with me, I have Kent Hersey, and I'll just have you kind of explain your title, what you do, and how long you've been with the division.
Okay, hi, I'm Kent Hersey. I'm the Big Game Projects Coordinator out of our Salt Lake office. I deal a lot with our big game research projects, our captures, our transplants, and then help with the management plans, recommendations, things like that. And I've been with the division for about 15 years now.
Kent's a big deal. He'll also be in one of our future episodes that we're going to be talking about those captures, which is super cool. And then we have Covey.
Hi, I'm Covey Jones. I'm the Big Game Coordinator for the state, and I work with the biologists and wildlife managers throughout the state to oversee the big game program, make sure that we're recommending the appropriate number of permits and that herds are healthy, and we're doing our best to manage wildlife the way the public wants to see it managed.
Awesome. And then we have Dax.
Hi, I'm Dax Mangus. I'm the Wildlife Program Manager from the DWR's Northeastern Region office. And in that office, I oversee both the big game programs, upland game, small game, our depredation and nuisance, urban wildlife, kind of a little bit of everything, but a lot of the time and effort is focused on things related to big game.
Awesome. And how long have you been with the division?
I've been with the division a little over 13 years.
Okay. And did you say, Covey, how long you've been with the division?
12 years.
12 years, okay. So we have a lot of experience, obviously, in the room. And yeah, like I mentioned, we wanted to kind of just go over some of the questions we've gotten recently, kind of repeatedly, on just how some of the things are working with our big game management. So one of the first questions we wanted to start off with, all of these came from our social media pages. And this one we've been getting a lot recently after the fall hunts. This one was in the fall. You said we have the highest deer numbers in 25 years. And then you said this winter that populations are down. So they kind of wanted us to explain that and kind of add some clarity on which of those is correct. So
yeah, I can start. I can start on that for sure.
Go, Covey.
If you look back through the history of mule deer in the state, we grew a lot of deer, and we grew a lot of deer from about 2011 through 2016. You know, before that, our population was hovering just below 300,000.
Okay.
So our population was hovering just below 300,000, about 286. And since the big crash that we had in the early 90s, we've been bouncing around there, you know, between high 200s, low 300s. From 2011 through 2006, we grew a lot of deer. And almost our modeled population growth was 100,000 animals. Now, 2017, 2018, we knew that number fell off a little bit, or that it wasn't quite as high as we peaked at 2016. But it also a lot of deer across the state. And the statement that we made was that there are a lot of bucks on the landscape. And the reason we made that statement, or that I made that statement, was because factually we managed for a lot higher buck-doe ratio than we used to. You know, you always hear about the glory days of hunting, or when buck hunting in the 80s, and we had a lot of deer on the landscape in the 80s. You know, obviously we had more deer on the landscape than we have now, but we managed for a lot lower buck-doe ratios. You know, our postseason classification, when you go back through the old biologist journals, a lot of them were coming in at about 8. You know, now on a general season unit, we manage for between 15 and 20 bucks per 100 does. And so with the recent population growth through 2016 and the increased buck-doe ratios, there are a lot of bucks on the landscape. The other part that I think needs to be clarified here is in that statement we did say there were units where we'd seen poor overwinter survival. Some of the core units around the central of the state, survival was adequate to maintain the population. You know, the Wasatch, the Manti, the Nebo. But then we look in northeastern and northern Utah and some of southeastern Utah and portions of southern Utah, we really saw some drops in those populations. And honestly, some of those drops, when we compiled all of the data for 2019 in December, were significant.
What causes some of those kind of ebbs and flows of our populations?
And so this past year, what we saw was pretty much weather driven, and we had was kind of a perfect storm. We had
Pun intended, I hope.
It wasn't, but I guess it worked. But we had, if you recall, the summer of 2018 was really dry.
Mm-hmm. Tons of wildfires, yeah.
Yeah, and when you have those dry conditions, you're not getting the vegetative growth that you need, or that deer need, to put on a lot of fat reserves, and that's really what they need. And so what we saw...
To be able to make it through the winter.
Yeah, exactly. So what they do is they basically spend the spring and summer putting on fat, and on some units we saw it down like 30% from the previous years. And so what that meant is coming into winter, they were in pretty poor condition. And then on top of that, you know, you threw in this really hard winter with deep snows in many places that lasted a long time. And so they didn't have good fat reserves, and they used them up fairly quickly due to the hard weather, and that causes poor survival. And then the good news about these hard storms is that they do give you a lot of moisture, so that in the spring they actually had good forage, and this past year they came in really fat. So hopefully that can lead to some recovery.
For this winter.
Precisely,
to make it through.
yeah. And so far the winter is actually pretty good from a survival standpoint. But you have these different climatic patterns happening across the state, and as you know, that basically dictates what the deer are going to look like and how their survival goes. And of course, other things play into it, but it's climate that really shows these up and down cycles and drives these population patterns.
Gotcha.
I think where it gets confusing for the public sometimes is that we say, you know, in one breath, we'll say, deer right now are doing good. And what we mean by that is this winter when we went out and caught deer, they were fat, they were healthy. They've got a greater chance at surviving this winter. And so when we talk about the sampling we did, those deer were doing good. Now, obviously, the ones that died in last winter, they weren't doing so well.
Right.
And so there gets to be that confusion of, well, you said deer are doing poor, deer are doing well, deer are doing... And the truth is, they're both true. Deer were doing great. And then in 2019, throughout that year, because of the conditions we had that winter and the previous summer, deer fell off, and we lost a lot of deer. And when we did that, and I hope we can get into this a little bit today, but deer are driven by climate a lot, and they're also driven by population density. So when deer fell off, and what I mean by fell off is that we had higher than average mortality. And when we had higher than average mortality, we reduced densities across the landscape. So this year, we had fewer deer on the landscape. But when they came in and we looked at body condition scores as an indicator of population health, because density was lower or fewer animals, they were fatter. And that's important to note.
And that's kind of just because there's not as many competing for the same food in an area? Is that kind of why that is?
Yeah, that's kind of the classic density, density-related, density dependence. If you have a finite amount of a resource, there's only a certain amount of feed on the mountain. If you've got, thousands and thousands of deer versus, a smaller number, there's less competition, there's more feed available.
Right.
They tend to do better, be in better condition, better shape. One of the things to keep in mind is that deer populations always fluctuate. They go up, they go down, and it's a combination of factors. Weather, precipitation, and timing of precipitation is usually, the biggest driving factor. There's other things that come into play as well, but, always deer populations have gone up, gone down. We don't always like that. Sometimes it's frustrating to us. And it's really great when, conditions are perfect and we have, adequate moisture throughout the spring and summer, and then we have a mild winter and deer populations grow. Everybody loves it. And then you have some, like Kent talked about, the perfect storm. We have horrible drought followed by a really severe winter with, 200+% of normal snowpack, and it lasts, it's a long winter, and you have really poor fawn survival. Those years are kind of crummy if you're a deer guy. If you love mule deer, it's kind of crummy, but some of that's just unavoidable, and it's going to happen. And it's done that for a long, long time, and will continue to do that into the future. After you have a bad winter, you have good growth, you have good forage, numbers are less, so you have lower deer density, so there's more resources available for those deer, and they tend to bounce back. So it's kind of what they do.
Yeah, and with the fall off in populations, I think just as one last note, we are attempting to address those other factors that could suppress the population and reduce the growth rate. So we've been very active at targeting predators. As we grew a lot of deer, we grew a lot of predators.
Right.
And we've worked hard to address that in areas where it needed to be addressed too.
Well, and one thing I want to point out too, I mean, I'm still super new to the division, obviously. But like, obviously we can't control the weather, right? That's not something we can do. But I've seen a lot of the different projects that we'll do will help increase habitat in some of these like feeding areas for the deer when there is a really big drought year or something, so they have more feed to kind of help them get through that, which, yeah, that's an important factor too, along with the predator control that you mentioned. And kind of segueing into this next question, when do you typically get the data for the deer population numbers and things in order to make your recommendations? Because the next question, they basically want to know that process of how we conduct these deer counts, you know, to see populations, and then how our permit number recommendations correlate with those counts. So yeah, kind of what's the timing on that?
Maybe I'll start on this one. I work out in one of the regions. You know, that's where we start this process of collecting this information, collecting the data. And so what we do, just to be really clear, it's not necessarily a count, but we do a classification. District biologists
explain what that means.
Across the state, we typically start and run from about mid-November till mid-December, which is when the mule deer rut, you know, the breeding season, when you're most likely to have your bucks and does together. They're not, you know, at other times of the year, bucks and does are sometimes separated, more likely to be concentrated on winter ranges where biologists can more easily find and observe those deer. So we go out, biologists on all the districts across the state, go out, spend a lot of early mornings, late evenings, classifying deer. So they'll go, you know, they're driving down an old 2-track somewhere, trying not to get stuck in the snow and mud, which they do get stuck sometimes.
And like, you sound like you're speaking from experience, Dax.
And you know, they'll see a group of deer, you know, park the truck, set up the spotting scope if they're far away, you know, pull out the binoculars, and they'll write down how many does, how many fawns, and how many bucks. And
that's what you mean by classifying.
Yeah, so
they're not counting the total number.
They count the numbers as well, and we shoot for, you know, a sample size. We want to make sure we have an adequate sample size to minimize error associated with that classification. And so we get a good representative sample from across the unit, all the different areas, you know, where we have concentrations of deer. And so at the end of that, biologists, you know, will compile that information and look at that classification data for the different hunting units. You know, what's our buck to doe ratio? What's our fawn to doe ratio? And those are the two key ratios that we get from that information that help us in coming up with population estimates and also looking at the way we're hunting bucks and, you know, buck permit numbers in the future. And we have targets, we have, you know, objectives of post-season buck to doe ratio. So we're saying after the hunts are over, how many bucks per 100 does do we want to still have on the landscape?
Right.
And that really is a guide, a measure really of kind of quality. The number of bucks that are left after the hunt is pretty indicative of, you know, a very high buck to doe ratio after the hunt means you have a lot of bucks on that unit. It's probably a higher quality type hunt, a hunt that's geared more towards producing, you know, older age class or trophy bucks. If you have a low buck to doe ratio, that means it's probably a unit that's managed more towards the opportunity end of things, giving people the opportunity to go out and hunt. And so, you know, biologists across the state will go out, do that classification during kind of that mule deer rut period, and then we compile all that information and send it into Salt Lake. And maybe Kent wants to talk, and Colby wants to talk a little bit about kind of where we go from there.
So I think the key with these is Dax hit on with it's count versus classification. So with
Right.
elk and these other species, we can actually take a helicopter, go out, we count them. It's an attempted census of that area. So we try and count every animal, and clearly we don't due to various factors.
With elk, we do that.
With elk, this is elk, yeah. But with deer, because of the way they scatter when they see the helicopter, they just kind of bolt around and just like popcorn. They don't really lend themselves to that type of a situation, and because you have to cover so much area, it's not a real effective measure to go and try and do a complete census. So we do these classification, and the way it works is that it's trend over time that's crucial with it. So we know through our harvest data how many animals we're removing through hunters each year. We know through our collar data how many survive on a given year from the adult standpoint and also from the fawns. And then we know how many are born each year from those fawn-doe ratios. And so when we put all those data together, that's what tells us how many animals we must have had on the landscape in order to remove that many through harvest and natural mortality. And then also maintain those ratios at a certain level. So basically, if we see those ratios staying the same and we keep harvesting the same amount of animals, we know that permit number is pretty spot on to maintain our objectives where we want it.
Right.
However, if in a given year we see that buck-doe ratio declining over the last couple years or something, that indicates that we're probably removing too many animals to maintain that buck-doe ratio given the current conditions that population is seeing. So then we need to reduce permits in order to bring that ratio up and help stabilize that population or that buck-doe objective where we want it to be. And it starts getting pretty complex, and it does deal with a lot of math, and it's changing ratio stuff. So it might be a little confusing to people, but it's basically just putting all the numbers together, and it indicates in order to have this kind of thing that we're seeing on the ground with these ratios and this harvest and all that, we must have had this many animals in the landscape. And
Absolutely. There's a couple things here. One, every bit of this data that we collect, right, the buck-doe ratio, survival, harvest, we then go back in and can model the population. Kent mentioned this, and he went into ratio data a little bit. But one of the things that really helps people understand this is we all have a bank account, right? We all have money. We all have a bank account. And Faith, let's say you go out and you spend $10 in your bank account, and then you check it the very next day, and you have $90 in there. You know that you had to have had
100.
$100.
I'm so good at math, you guys.
You're amazing. Right. So it that's a very simplified version of how populations work, right?
Right.
So we know that if we have this many left over, if this is our buck-doe ratio postseason, and we know what our survival was, right, and we know how many males we removed through hunter harvest.
And hunters are required to report how many.
It's a random sample, but we make sure and hit the number that we need to hit to have a very low margin of error.
I see. Okay.
Right. And we're working on e-tagging and some other things that'll actually make it so that everybody reports when they punch out.
Oh, that's cool.
So that'll be coming in the next couple of years. But at the end of the day, the harvest data that we get on, especially on general season, it's very low margins of error. So we know these things. So we know we had to have had at least this many deer in order for that to work.
Right.
You know, there are a lot of questions about what models the division uses. For deer, we use it's a spreadsheet model. It was developed by Dr. Gary White. You know, anybody can look it up and read the publication that he did on the model, read about it if they want to. Colorado uses this model. Other states use the same model. And this type of deer management using buck-doe ratios is not unique to Utah. You know, I wish we could say that we pioneered this, we invented this, we're the best. But the truth is that every state that manages mule deer uses the same metrics. You know, luckily in Utah, what I will say is that a lot of states assume a few things. One, they assume some average survivals and things like that. And Utah's actually gone out and spent the money on GPS satellite collars in order to determine actual survival. So we have some better metrics than some of our partners in surrounding states. We have better data going into the models, and I know it's given us a better product in the long run. And they're good. It's not perfect. There is no perfect metric in biological systems, but what we have is really good, and we'll always work to make it better whenever we can.
Right. And with this kind of doing your census, I like that word more than classifications maybe. So when you do that during the fall, you're kind of getting the after the hunt numbers. Do you also do it in the spring to know kind of what your winter kill was, or how do you determine that before you make the permit recommendations in April?
So just a point of clarification, this is where it gets confusing, because the census is what we do on a lot of other species. It's the Henson census for elk and stuff, but for deer, we can't do that.
You did say that, yeah.
This is where the classification comes in. But yeah, historically what we did was a count in the spring to see what your overwinter survival was.
Right.
But with the collaring efforts that we do, now we collar on at least 7 representative units statewide. We go out and we collar 20 fawns on each one of those units. So a minimum of 140, and not often we have some other projects going on where we'll catch some fawns on that. So we'll usually have a couple hundred fawns on the air each year to monitor survival. And so we use those collars to actually get our survival estimates.
Gotcha.
And it's a much greater improvement on our data quality, because we get that over winter survival, but then we also get it throughout the year. And sometimes we will see this mortality happening in June, July, August as well. So we get better, more accurate information throughout the year.
Gotcha. That's awesome.
I was going to tell just kind of a funny story talking about classification and then also these population models. So I was a brand new biologist. I got a district over there outside Vernal, and I looked at the population model, how many deer it said there were on this unit, my unit. And I went out during that period of time, kind of mid-November to mid-December, and classified deer and counted deer across, most of these core winter range areas. And at the end of it, when I had looked at it, I'd classified, a little over 1,000 deer. And I felt like, well, I, put a lot of time and effort, and I probably saw almost all the deer that are out there. And then I looked at the population modeled number, and it was like 5,000 or 6,000 deer. And I thought, well, that can't be right, Maybe the coffee shop talk is correct, and the division's, making these numbers up. And so I did exactly what Covey was talking about. If you spend $10 and the balance in your bank account is 90, it means you had to have started with at least 100. So I got down and just simple math, got on a spreadsheet and started plugging in numbers. Okay, this is how many deer we harvested. This was our, prior year's buck to doe ratio. These are our survival estimates. And started doing the math and kind of back calculating how many deer would we have to have in order to harvest as many as we harvested, and then still have, this kind of breakdown, these classification ratios after the season is over. And I did the math. I took a little time, nothing complicated, basic algebra. Just did it like in a spreadsheet, and when I was done, the number that I came up with was like within a few hundred deer of what our population model was. And so
it's working.
Just the basic math. There's no way we could harvest, start with this and end with this by harvesting this many deer, if we didn't have this number. And I realized I was good. I'm a good biologist, but no matter how good you are, you never see everything from the ground, even from the air. When we do our attempted census and try to count all the elk on the unit, we know we don't see all the elk. But it was a good exercise for me and helped me kind of wrap my head around the model and how we come up with that. And it basically let me kind of ground truth what I was seeing. And that can be hard because sometimes our sportsmen, they're like, well, I spend every Saturday during the rut driving around, and I only saw this.
Sure.
And it can be hard to wrap your head around it sometimes.
You're not going to see them all, yeah.
It's funny because it really became apparent for our biologists when we started big collaring efforts. When we started big collaring efforts, and they would say, I know I saw a lot of deer. And I went out and classified, and I saw 6 of the 100 deer that we put collars on.
Were there, yeah. 6.
And then they'll look back through their data, and they counted about 6. They classified about 6% of the population.
That's interesting.
And it lines up very well.
And that's why it's just kind of the ratio of the overall population.
It allows us to reconstruct that. And I would say that's what we use to establish a number of buck permits. And at some point in here, I don't know if it's now, Faith, or later, but we should probably get into like what buck hunting means in Utah, and what buck hunting means in relationship to population management. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions on this.
Yeah, I think this is a good point to segue into that. Yeah, just kind of explaining how you manage that. Because, the next question was they want to know how can our age class of buck deer in Utah be increased? Because all they see are smaller bucks. We've shot too many of the big ones. So, it would be good to kind of explain that.
I'll take a stab at this one to start if you guys are okay with that. I think the funny part is that this is actually the easiest thing in the world to do, and we can do it. And that just is simply by reducing permits to a level where you start to reduce harvest and allow more bucks to be on the landscape, right?
So just less permits overall.
Yeah, but the cut isn't 1-to-1. You have to remember that, because as you start to reduce permits and increase buck-doe ratios, and that's a surrogate for increasing the number of bucks on the landscape, you also start to increase hunter harvest success, right? And I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea. We want hunters to be successful. We want everybody who goes out, works hard, has a permit in their pocket, and dreams about harvesting that big buck to have his dreams or her dreams, their dreams come true.
Right.
But when you start to evaluate the data and look at the data, you have to cut a lot of permits in order to manage for that extreme high-quality animal. And we have a few of those units in the state. When we look around, we've got the Henrys and the Paunsaugunt, which are 2 units that we've said, okay, we're going to set these 2 aside and manage for extreme quality. Then we have several others like the Book Cliffs, the Vernon, the Oak Creeks, where we've said, okay, we're going to set these aside and manage for above average quality. And on those units where we do that, we have a lot of mature bucks. And the trade-off is, how long do you want to wait to hunt mule deer?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
And we see this all the time. And I think the important thing here is that this gets confused with, well, if we hunt fewer bucks, right, that we'll have more deer on the landscape. And that simply isn't accurate. Buck hunting, for the most part, you're removing a surplus, right? Because as long as all of your does are pregnant and all of your does have the ability to have a fawn that next year, your population should continue to grow. It should continue to grow unless you're hitting other limiting factors, whether those be whatever they may be, climate or habitat conditions. As long as you're bumping up against some limiting factor, that's what's going to stop that overall population from growing. And every time we've gone out in Utah and looked at pregnancy rates in deer, we're at about 95%.
I'm not a biologist, but how many does can one buck breed? Because like you said, that's why your ratios are different, because you don't need 1-to-1, one buck for every doe, right?
They're not monogamous.
Yeah.
Yeah, bottom line, if a buck finds a doe that's in estrus, he can breed her, and they have a relatively short window when a doe is in estrus. But as long as you're above, I think 8 bucks per 100 does, almost all of your does are going to be pregnant.
Wow.
And the data's pretty clear on that. And I think one thing that really wasn't brought up on social media, but we do hear sometimes, is that with these low buck doe ratios, one of the side effects of that is that it's these does are actually not getting bred on their first cycle, and they're having to go into multiple estrus cycles, and then that prolongs the fawning period and causes some issues there. But we have actually looked at that, and we've had a lot of data come in with some studies where we're looking at neonate birth timing and all that, and we haven't actually seen any difference whatsoever when we have these low buck doe ratios in the 12 area, like we had on Monroe, versus some areas that we've had high buck doe ratios. A study that had, I think it was 25 bucks per 100 does in Colorado, plus also some stuff on the Book Cliffs we've recently done. We have, on both units, we have these very succinct fawning periods. And so it doesn't seem to be making a difference whatsoever on the timing of the birth or on the length of that fawning period, regardless of your buck doe ratio. So as long as these does are getting pregnant, they seem to be getting pregnant as soon as they come into estrus, which is mainly driven by their overall habitat quality and their nutrition available. And then, as long as they're pregnant, the fawns are being born at a good time, and depends on the conditions that they have when they're being born as to what they survive.
Like Kent's saying, and the data has shown this, we can have buck-to-doe ratios in the single digits, and from a biological standpoint, it's fine. It's adequate. The does are all bred during, a relatively small window during the breeding season. And so then when we get into, are we going to manage a unit for 15 to 17 bucks per 100 does postseason, 18 to 20 bucks per 100 does, whatever, the different, or 25 to 35, those are social decisions. We're outside the realm of biological implications for the most part, and really what we're looking at is what kind of quality do we want to manage this for. And in Utah, we try to have a mix, like Kobe talked about. We've got some units that are managed for, really high buck-to-doe ratios, and all of that management for bucks is based on really its social considerations and kind of this diversity, this mix between opportunity to hunt and quality and how long people want to wait. But one of the hard things that I think is a challenge oftentimes, and I get to have a unique perspective on this as someone who loves to hunt and enjoys hunting mule deer, but also someone who manages mule deer populations.
Sure.
And I hear this all the time. My own father-in-law was really beating me up last weekend telling me, oh, deer numbers are down, you really got to cut buck tags. And I look at the data, and actually our buck-to-doe ratios really didn't decline that much, and our deer numbers didn't decline. We were talking about the unit where we hunt. But we had a tough deer hunt last fall. Like, we didn't see as many deer as we normally see. And, in our area where we like to hunt, we saw fewer deer, we saw fewer bucks. And so my father-in-law was like, well, you really gotta save the deer herd and cut a bunch of buck tags. And honestly, from a deer population management standpoint, the postseason buck-to-doe ratio data, we're approaching, I think we're at 19 bucks per 100 does on that particular unit. We're well above the biological threshold where, you have a shortage of bucks and it's going to impact your population. It was cutting buck tags on that particular unit. The only thing it's going to do is make it harder to draw a tag, and it would probably, save a few bucks, and maybe your buck-to-doe ratio would go up the next year. You might over time see an increase in buck quality, but it's not going to drive the population, the overall numbers of deer up or down. And And it's really hard to kind of wrap your head around that sometimes. And one of the reasons it's hard to wrap your head around that is because when we do cut a bunch of buck tags and then hunters go down there and they see more bucks, in their mind, it's a no-brainer. It's like, oh, this unit's way better than it used to be. There's tons of bucks now because they're buck hunters and they're hunting bucks. And so they have a different perspective. They look at it differently than a biologist who's not just looking at it for a week at a time in October, with a rifle in their hand, but they're looking at it over 12 months of the year, from the summer range to the transition range to the winter range, and looking at fawn numbers and all these different things that we look at. We look at the same resource, but from different perspectives. And
Right.
so I managed the Book Cliffs unit for a lot of years, and it's still out there in my region. And the Book Cliffs unit was a unit that had really low buck-to-doe ratio, was probably getting hunted harder than it should have been, and so they closed it for 3 years. And during those 3 years, the buck-to-doe ratio really jumped up. It went from, buck-to-doe ratios in the single digits to, within just a few years, we had buck-to-doe ratios that were, in the 40s, 40 plus bucks per 100 does. So if you were a sportsman and you had been down there and hunted, 3 or 4 years prior, you'd see deer and hardly any bucks. You were lucky to find a spike. And then 3 or 4 years later, if you drove down there and looked around, you'd see a lot of bucks. You could drive across the top of the summer range and see, 40 big bucks in a day or something. And so everyone was like, well, that was the trick. That was the ticket. We closed the unit for 3 years, and now this deer herd is recovered and everything's great. That's the key. That's what saved the Book Cliffs. But I'm looking at the data right now, and our population number in the Book Cliffs is the lowest it's been in 20 plus years. Our overall number of deer is the lowest it's been in 20 plus years. And we still have a postseason buck-to-doe ratio, in the mid to upper 30s. And so when we cut buck tags, it does make for a better deer hunt if you're hunting that unit. It might be harder to draw the tag,
Right.
but if you have the tag in your pocket, it makes for a better deer hunt. And for so many sportsmen, myself included, you go to a unit with a lot of bucks, you think, this unit's awesome, it's managed really well, this deer herd must be doing great. And in reality, there's a relationship between overall population numbers and what's happening with bucks. But you can hunt a unit that has a declining population and the population's way lower than it used to be, but we can still have big bucks on that unit and have a relatively high number of bucks. Or you can hunt a unit where the deer population is stable or increasing, it's doing really well, but we manage it for, opportunity to let a lot of people hunt there, and it might be hard to find big bucks. You might see a lot of deer and not see a lot of bucks. But that's the hard thing to wrap your head around, because so many folks see a lot of bucks and they think, oh, this unit's amazing, it's so great, we need to do this all across the state. And really, that's why I think it's really important to kind of understand the difference between managing bucks and buck hunting versus managing overall population numbers. And it can make it hard because, seeing is believing. You go somewhere seeing a lot of bucks, you think, well, this is the best, we should do this everywhere. And there's trade-offs. Mule deer management is largely about trade-offs.
It really
That's
is.
great.
I couldn't agree more. And as a sportsman myself, again, the trade-off is you can't hunt deer without a tag in your pocket. Legally, everybody. Legally.
Yeah. We do
So-
promote legal hunting here. Yeah.
And if we were to go statewide and cut permits to a point where you could have a Henry's or even a Book Cliffs quality hunt across the state, you wouldn't be drawing every other year anymore. You wouldn't be drawing every third year anymore. It would be several years. Some of these units should be waiting 10 plus years to get a tag in your pocket.
Which I would guess most people wouldn't be happy about that either.
It's such a hard balance to strike.
Right. Right.
We all love quality mule deer.
Well, I just want to hunt really big bucks every single year, and I don't want anyone else to be out there but me and my friends and family, and I want us to see huge deer every year.
Yeah.
Come on, Colby.
Is that too much to ask?
Yeah, come on.
Seriously. If anybody could make it happen, Kent could.
Right.
That's why we employ him.
The brains of the operation. So, and Dax, you brought up something interesting about just the Book Cliffs example of kind of the waiting 3 years. And I know with our permit recommendations, we are doing that on a yearly basis every year in April. I guess, is that hard to find that balance when you're recommending every year to know the exact number to recommend? Because I guess it does take a while to kind of see how things play out over time.
It allows us to be the most reactive we could be. And
Doing it year to year.
Yeah, in wildlife management, you're always reacting to last year, right?
I see.
Always. And so the ability to adjust permits annually, sometimes it feels like you're chasing your tail, but it allows us to be reactive to whatever climatic conditions or whatever conditions we're facing for that
Right.
year.
That previous year. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess with that, I mean, the key is that we have long-term data sets, so we can go back and
Look at the trends.
look and see how things have done over the past 5 years, 10 years, 3 years, whatever we want it to be. And so we can adjust things going forward. And we do predict forward the best we can. Obviously, it's challenging, but as we get more and more data in, we're able to understand what did things look like over the winter. And on these general season units where you have poor fawn survival, but that those fawns are next year's yearling bucks, which on a general season unit with a 15 to 17 buck to doe ratio makes up a big proportion of what people hunt. We can start to be more reactive to some permit adjustments if needed because of really poor fawn survival. And that's in the new mule deer plan. That's something that we are going to take into consideration much more than we have in the past, and it's in the plan. So, as we get these data and we learn more about how to adjust things, that's stuff we just keep learning and moving forward, how to do things better, and that's what we try and do.
Awesome.
We're all about kind of that adaptive management ideal where, you get information, best information you have, you apply that information, you get feedback from how that's working, and then you continue to make adjustments. That's the cycle we're in. This is actually a super exciting time to work in big game management in Utah. You look at the collar studies, the survival studies, all the different things that are going on, and just the quality and quantity of data that we have now is incredible. I tell people sometimes it's super cool to work in wildlife right now because we're making the switch from analog to digital. Just in my relatively short career, we've gone from, a VHF collar, radio collar that you'd put on an animal, and you'd hike up on a hill somewhere and get a compass bearing using your antenna of, okay, it's, however many degrees south from here, and then you'd go get another location and a bearing from another spot and then triangulate to try to figure out where that animal is. And I remember working on a study when I was at Utah State, and we were doing that once a week for all the deer we had collars on, and then we decided we were really going to pick up the pace and get really intensive in our monitoring, and we were going to get 2 locations a week on all of our deer. And these locations were pretty rough because we're just, triangulating based on compass bearings from 2 different locations. And now we've got how many animals with collars, and talk a little bit about how many animals and collars and the precision and the quantity. It's an incredible time to work in wildlife management.
Yeah, so the data we get these days, it's ridiculous. Everything we collar now is a satellite GPS transmitter. It lasts 3 years on each animal. We get a point every 2 hours.
Yeah,
So
that's crazy.
when I first started in wildlife in grad school, it was all about if you had 30 locations on an animal, that was a really good sample for that. And now we get that in 3 days. So it's just going tremendous benefit. We actually have 2,500 collars out right now on animals. This year we're focused on capturing, I think it's just over 1,300 animals across all species, not just mule deer, but I think 800 plus mule deer being caught. So tremendous amount of effort to get the data we need to manage these populations the best we can and to learn from them. And yeah, as Dak said, it's just an exciting time. The data quality we're getting now and what we're learning from this is just incredible.
That's awesome.
We're learning sometimes we were wrong, right? We thought these populations always migrated at this time or they always behaved this way. And with VHF collars, or the technology that we used to have, it seemed to always hold true. And then right now we're seeing actually how animals and populations use the landscape. And we're getting better every day.
That's super cool. And some of them are random. I saw one that they had one of the does they had collared, it showed that it swam all the way across Flaming Gorge, just random stuff that you wouldn't think, that the animals are moving the way they are, but that's really cool. And that actually kind of segues into the next question that we got. Somebody was asking if we are going to release the data from these deer collar studies as far as the migration, kind of where they're migrating across the state, and then kind of their survival rate during the winter. So they were wondering about that.
So I think the answer to that is simple. It's absolutely. We will release as much data as we can. So in the next few weeks, you should see our Migration Initiative website go live. It'll have a lot of, it'll show corridors and areas that are used by wildlife. And we hope to continue to work to provide the rest of the data as well. Survival rates, cause-specific mortality, all the metrics that we're taking, we want to provide to the public. And we're working through how we provide that in platforms or dashboards that are understandable, easy to read, user-friendly. As an agency that serves the public and manages their wildlife, we try to be as open and transparent as we can. There are some information that we are taking. There are some data that are protected. Specific locations of animals, specific animals, we don't intend to release. We're not going to release that. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Frankly, it crosses some ethical boundaries.
Sure.
We still hunt these animals. We still manage these animals, and releasing individual locations of wildlife across the state could put a lot of us as hunters and sportsmen in some very ethical situations that we don't want to be in.
Right.
So,
And I think we'll, boil some of that information, the location information down to, identify, submarine areas, transition areas, migration corridors, wintering areas. But yeah, as far as giving, specific locations of one individual buck deer, no, that's not what we're going to do.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of funny, we're so excited about this, and it's really, like I was saying, kind of a transformative time in wildlife management. And our biologists, they're out on the ground recovering collars to determine, cause-specific mortality when we have animals that die. If these collars, become stationary, they don't move for a certain period of time, it triggers an alert and sends out an email. And Kent's up all night sending us emails telling us we need to go pick up this collar somewhere. And the biologists are happy to do that and get that information. What are the complications? I think we were all in and everyone jumped in gung-ho to go collect all this information and see what's going on. But the quantity of information, we've crashed some servers because we didn't have enough capacity to store and process all the locations. And so it's something we're working on, and it's been a work in progress, is finding good ways to synthesize all this information and put it out there to the public. And we're working through that. I think we've had a couple hiccups maybe just because there's so much information. It's a great problem to have, though. I love having so much information that it's hard to synthesize it all and get it out there. But that is our intention, and that is what we want to do.
absolutely.
Awesome. So we've talked a lot about, mule deer management. This last question was specifically about elk. They'd asked, have you ever or do you ever plan to move the archery elk hunt into the rut? And if not, explain why.
So, Faith, one of the things we've said over and over again during this podcast, and we try to stress, is that really we're trustee and guardian of the state's wildlife. And it's an honor to be able to do that. But we try to manage wildlife the way that the public wants it managed. The problem is that the public is very diverse.
Sure.
Right? And so whenever we look at season structure, hunt dates, or weapon types, we always try to get a survey and get a representative survey of all the constituents that hunt that species or have interest in that species. And when we do that, we've done that for elk several times. And every time we do that, and we've done that just about our season dates in hunters in general, and the overwhelming majority comes back and says, leave it alone. We like it the way that it is. And so I'm an archery hunter. I hunt with a bow. I love to archery hunt. I would love hunting elk in the rut in Utah. And so for me, sounds great. Let's do it. But when I go back and look at the survey data and what the majority of our constituents want, and a lot of hunters have been waiting a lot of years for these permits, 20 plus years to be able to hunt elk. And they're planning on hunting elk with a rifle in the rut. And so to turn that clock back and remove that opportunity, it's not possible. It's not feasible right now.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And one thing I'd add there, if we saw a biological issue with this, we would certainly step in and say, all right, we need to change something because we're causing some harm to these populations. However, with the level that we're hunting these animals and the low number of permits, it isn't a biological issue at this point. There's no genetic component. We're not hurting genetics or anything like that because of hunting elk with a rifle in the rut. And so it just comes down to a social issue. And as Covey said, that as of now, the majority want to hunt with a rifle in the rut and keep it the way it is.
I guess one other thing I'd bring up too is we have a public process, and a lot of times people think, well, the division, why don't you guys do this, or why did you do this, or why didn't you do that? And I think sometimes a lot of folks don't realize that the division doesn't actually make a lot of these decisions. We collect the information, we try to present the data, and we'll make recommendations in the context of kind of the direction we've been given. That, typically it's a management plan. We have a statewide management plan that has certain targets and criteria in it. And so we collect the information, we make a recommendation based on the direction that we've received through these plans. And then those recommendations, along with the plans that those recommendations are based on, all of those go through our public process. They go through the Regional Advisory Council, the RACs, and then ultimately the Wildlife Board, here's that input and makes a decision. Most of the time, the data that we collect, the constraints that we're given, in these management plans, stuff goes over pretty good. Occasionally it doesn't. Sometimes the public decides, no, we've changed our mind. That's not what we want. And, people show up in numbers at the RAC meetings or come to the Wildlife Board meeting, and sometimes the RACs and the Wildlife Board decide to go in a different direction. That's okay. A lot of these decisions occur in that space that's in between these biological sideboards. And, in between these biological sideboards, there's a lot of room for stuff to shift just depending on social preferences, whether we're hunting more elk in September with a bow or with a rifle. As long as we're within those biological sideboards, that's really kind of a social decision. And if a lot of people get together and say, we want to change this, and everyone says, yeah, let's change it, it could change. But based on the information we get right now, it doesn't. The people that really like bow hunting probably want to change it. The people that really like rifle hunting probably don't want to change it. Just to keep in mind that things can and do change. If a lot of people get together and decide they want to do something different, sometimes it changes.
Yeah.
Dax brings up a great point. I love our public process. It takes a lot of time. It takes 4 weeks a year on the road. In addition to that, several Wildlife Board meetings. And I'm just talking about just big game recommendations. Right. But our public process it's amazing. Almost every public meeting I attend or present at after, I'll have somebody stand up who didn't agree with one of the recommendations or didn't like it or had a different opinion. And they'll come up to me after and say, I'm sorry, but I just had to voice my opinion. And I say, don't be sorry.
That's what it's for.
Yeah, I would rather have somebody stand up here and disagree with me and get involved and present their side and even get something changed than not care, not show up.
Right.
It's not a win-lose, right? If we're managing wildlife within the biological constraints and the way that the public wants to see it managed, then it's a win. If we've missed the mark, let us know. We're okay to readjust. We're okay to move the mark. We're okay to change things. But you have to get involved in the process if you want to make those changes.
I'll include Covey's cell phone at the end of this episode.
I spend a lot of time on the cell phone.
Give his number out. Yeah, no, I'm just grateful that you guys were willing to come on and take a couple minutes to explain this, because this is something a lot of people in the state are passionate about. There's a lot of different opinions and viewpoints and some misinformation and misunderstanding. So I appreciate you guys coming on to explain this, and I feel like I've learned a lot as someone that's not a biologist. So hopefully this has been helpful for a lot of our listeners today as well. And as always, we would just recommend, if you have not yet, we'd love if you could subscribe to the Wild Podcast. We publish a new episode on the third Tuesday of each month, and we hope that you can join in next time for some more wildlife stories.